Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with veteran jazz percussionist, composer, and writer Barrett Martin. He opened up about his new 2021 CD called Stillpoint, recorded between 2019 and 20 when he lived in a remote cliff house in the wildlife. He is well known for his work with the Seattle rock bands Skin Yard, Screaming Trees, Mad Season, along with playing on albums by R.E.M, Stone Temple Pilots, and Queens of the Stone Age. He studied jazz and classical music and has completed his bachelor's and master's degrees in anthropology, linguistics, and ethnomusicology. His story is fascinating. Dig this interview.
I'm great. How are you doing?
Hey, good, man. Thanks for taking a minute out today.
Yeah, happy to talk with you.
Right on, man. Let's run right into your latest album and book, Stillpoint. And what I want to know, was this all kind of predicated off of the pandemic and everything that was going on?
Well, no, it was a coincidence, but a happy coincidence, because my wife and I had been traveling for the previous year. So we moved out of Seattle in 2018, and for most of 2019 we were traveling. So we spent several months in New Mexico, and we spent a few months in New York City. We were kind of trying to figure out where we wanted to live, kind of, more permanently. But we ended up coming back to Washington because a friend of ours sent us an email of a snapshot of a listing to rent this remote house. And we thought, you know what, let's just go way out into the wilderness and, focus on our spiritual practice and work on our books, because my wife was writing her first book. And I'm always writing and always doing music. And so we just thought that's the perfect place to go until we figure out where we want to be more permanently. And that was in it was almost exactly the summer solstice of 2019. So it was 6 months before everything started to get bad with the pandemic.
Wow, how serendipitous. So what happened after the pandemic came? How did life change for you? I mean, it would seem as though what you were doing before the pandemic is what everybody ended up doing during the pandemic, save for the stress and all of the heartache.
We had heartache too. I mean, I had friends that got really sick from the virus and were intubated. They were put on ventilators, and they survived, but, they were really, really messed up. My wife, one of her friends from high school died. Her friend's 2 children also died. So we did know people that were directly affected by it, and we just kind of had to, the nature of the place where we lived was, it was so remote that we weren't really going to go anywhere anyway, and it was a incredibly beautiful place because it was right on the sea cliff that overlooks the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and it's almost the northernmost point of the continental United States. I don't know if there's probably something a little bit further north, but we were pretty far north. And so we just kind of started, we could go to the grocery store. There was a grocery store that we could drive to, and we could get provisions, and we just kind of stayed home, and like everybody else, we just cooked every meal, didn't really go anywhere. We'd ride our bicycles, and mostly we meditated and worked on our books, and I wrote a whole bunch of music.
So how did this journey into jazz and music begin for you? What was the flashpoint? Kind of where were you born and raised, and kind of that early part of your life?
Well, this is actually an area where, because I grew up in Olympia, but kind of south and, not really in the city, out in the country. And my dad's whole side of the family was from the Olympic Peninsula because they were loggers that moved there in the early 1900s, or not like 1900, but probably about 1930, I think, is when the family migrated, because they were originally from Arkansas, and they were loggers in Arkansas too, in the Ozark Mountains. And then at some point, the opportunities in the Olympic Forest opened up, because that's where all these giant old growth forests were. So it's kind of funny in a kind of karmic way, because now, I do a lot of environmental advocacy work trying to protect forests, and I've worked in the Peruvian Amazon quite a bit. But my family used to cut those trees down. and they didn't get rich doing it either. They literally worked for the company store and just were paid with script, which is fake money basically. But they settled out there. So as a kid, I spent a lot of time going out there visiting aunts and uncles and exploring the Olympic Forest and the Olympic Mountains, which is just an incredible mountain range. But there's also a lot of wildlife out there because it's not a heavily populated part of Washington State. I mean, Washington has a lot of places like that are very open where there just aren't a lot of people, and this happens to be one of those places. So, it kind of reminded me of my childhood, but also as a middle-aged man, I saw all this stuff that I'd never seen before, that my mind was just more awake and more aware.
So talk to me a little bit about, what musicians kind of inspire you and how you kind of got on to the path to find your musical voice. The sort of short version of the long story would be that I really did start as a fan of jazz, and specifically the old big band and swing jazz that my grandparents grew up listening to. And they had a pretty good record collection of old 78s, although when they bought them, they would have been new 78s. But by the time I started listening to them, it was, these old, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Tommy Dorsey, Benny Goodman. They were pretty hip people. They were that World War II generation, so they were real salt of the earth and cool and, had pretty good taste, for not being professional musicians. So I grew up with that record collection, and then my dad had, sort of like that, 1970s record collection of outlaw country. So it was, Johnny Cash and Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings and, that kind of stuff. So by the time I got into high school, I had a pretty good, palette of music that I was influenced by. And of course, this is like the 1970s and 1980s, so it's way before anything digital. It was all LPs. But all through high school, I was still like totally into jazz. I played in the jazz band and also was in the marching band and had a little group in high school. And it wasn't until I got into college that I got exposed to more world music and classical music and things like that. And then, of course, I landed in Seattle in 1987, right before the grunge thing happened, and my drumming skills were more required in the rock and roll setting than they were in the jazz. So that's just kind of how the path took me to Seattle. I find it fascinating. Jimmy Chamberlain has a background in jazz, and there's a lot of rock guys that I just did not expect would have had that kind of backbone. So, as a jazz musician, I look at your bio and I see, R.E.M. and Mad Season and Stone Temple Pilots and all of that. I want to know, what was it like to be around, because that was the epicenter for music there in the 90s. I mean, the grunge scene, Seattle, the microscope was firmly over that area. What did you learn just kind of in general that helped you grow? And what was lasting that has made you a stronger artist now, not only in music, but in writing and in general?
That is a very good question. And I kind of have a pretty clear answer on that, because those bands you just listed, so R.E.M., Stone Temple Pilots, and I would even throw in the band Queens of the Stone Age because I played on one of their albums that, really launched them. The instruments I played on those records was not drum set. It was mallet instruments like marimba, vibraphone, and a lot of percussion. And that's all the stuff that I learned when I was studying jazz and classical when I was in music school at Western Washington University. The only bands that I played drums with were like Screaming Trees and Mad Season. But if you listen to the records that I played on, the drums actually, I'm even playing swing on the ride cymbal, and I'm playing marimba and vibraphone in those bands. Like not on every song, obviously, but on a few of them. But when I was kind of going through that formative era. And I was also doing a lot of recording session work in Los Angeles, so I would go back and forth between Seattle and LA. Mostly people wanted me to do the jazzy classical stuff, not the rock stuff. Like in R.E.M., I even played upright bass with them because I studied upright bass at the same time that I was studying drums in music school, and of course piano because that's required. But, you know, you had to study two musical instruments side by side because it gives you this different way of looking at music. You know, I'm as good of an upright bass player as I am a drummer because I've been playing both instruments, you know, since the mid-1980s. I remember one of my music teachers saying, like, if you can play all this other stuff, if you can play the mallets and the keyboards and the hand percussion and all that exotic stuff, you'll always be able to work because somebody will always want that. And that's not always the case if you just play, you know, rock and roll drums.
You know, I got to say personally, you know, in my 20s, I'm going to be 49 here in a few weeks, and that was kind of the bread and butter for me and all my friends. We really got into that scene. I remember even going up there in the late 90s, and it was awesome. Like, I went to one place, and the drummer for Soundgarden came in, and they were like, dude, do not go up to him, whatever you do. Just let him go. That's how the scene works. People kind of come in and do their thing. And I was really enamored with it. I got to tell you up front as a music lover, one of the best albums, one of the best creations that came out of that whole thing, as far as I'm concerned, and a lot of people I know, was Mad Season. One of the most sonically rich sounds that came out of it. There was so much that came out. So I just want you to know up front that was a stellar, beautiful compilation of musicians and music.
Oh, thank you. You know, that really is, I mean, I appreciate you saying that, but I feel the same way too. It's a really special album because, again, a short story about a longer story is that the four of us came together. You know, our musical chemistry gelled really quickly, like within one or two rehearsals, like we had the sound. And it was real natural and we didn't have to force anything. And what was cool about it is that we'd been in rock bands, you know, for a few years at that point. I mean, not much, you know, like each of us had only made a couple of rock albums at that point. We were open to like completely original ideas that would take it in a different direction. The band really kind of had this bluesy foundation, which I attribute a lot to John Baker Saunders, the bass player, it happens to be his birthday today. But he had been playing in the Chicago blues scene and was not a rock musician, was like the anti-rock star. But he had this really cool bluesy foundation that I was able to lock right into because it reminded me of, you know, studying, you know, blues and jazz, you know, which of course are the precursors of rock and roll. And so we had upright bass on the album and I was playing vibes and marimba and Mike was doing stuff on the guitar that he would never really get to do in Pearl Jam. And Lane, just being the genius that he was, just kind of created the vocals in his own unique way. And I think we tracked the entire album in less than 2 weeks and mixed it in 1 week. So the whole record was done in like 3 weeks. I just can't really think of a record that I've ever done that fast.
Wow, yeah, and that's a testament to the whole thing. I mean, I even remember when Alanis Morissette was talking about how long it took for them to do Jagged Little Pill. It was like astronomically short. But I think that thing that always gets me too about the world of jazz is that we have these ideas that like, all right, Radiohead's going to the studio in 5 months or however many months it's going to take. You get this idea, I think, in the mainstream that there's this long time that happens in the studio. But for jazz musicians, I'm always fascinated because it's like we did it in 1 or 2 sessions. We went in, half of it was improv. We never really knew each other, and they came out, and there was this beautiful gem that came out of their explorations.
Yeah, and I love that about jazz records. I was looking at Ron Carter, you know, the great jazz bassist. I was looking at his Instagram page because I, for some reason, had not found it yet. And, you know, he's played on over 2,000 albums.
Yeah.
Because just like you said, you know, you go in for, 4 hours or 6 hours and you do an entire record. Or Kinda Blue was done over the course of 2 sessions
Yeah.
probably, which total combined was probably 4 hours or maybe 6 hours, because they used to divide the sessions up in 3-hour blocks. I think the music union still does that. Like, it's a 3-hour block of time you get paid for, and you do as much as you can in 3 hours. And there's something really powerful about that, because you have to capture the spirit of the musicians, like right then, in the mood they're in the way the weather that day is, and just the way the inspiration is channeled through them. And it's very shamanic and alchemical, and it's a totally different way of recording than, highly produced, rock and pop records, or country music records for that matter. But I think that's why it has such a lasting imprint or a thumbprint on the American psyche. Jazz it really is, it's a completely purely American invention.
Yeah, it certainly is. It certainly is. The one thing that fascinates me about your background is you could have just as easily, with your degrees, gone into anthropology. You could have gone into linguistics. You could have gone into any number of things. And there's a level of you that's very Renaissance in that way. So my question to you is it really because you genuinely have that artistic spirit that you can't quiet? How did your life turn out this way? Why wasn't it something else? Do you ever reflect on that and think, man, how did I get here?
Well, because everybody's life has that quality, right? You think it's going to be this, but it's that. You start up on this journey or that pathway, and it becomes this other pathway. But I always loved music, and I knew that there was this magical quality in being a musician, like the way that you can positively affect your society, the way that you can, educate people through music, and just by being a musician or a composer or a recording artist, you do this thing that affects people, and not just in this country, but all over the world. So when my rock and roll career was kind of winding down in the early 2000s, I thought, you know what, I am going to go back to school, and I actually went into a PhD program. I didn't finish my PhD, but I did all my coursework, and I got a master's degree. But I took so many classes in world music and linguistics and cultural anthropology, and it was just incredible. I really loved being in school. And so then I became an adjunct college professor for 7 years at Antioch College in Seattle, which is a branch of the one in Yellow Springs, Ohio, the famous, liberal arts college, which has a cool history because that's the first college in the United States that was racially and gender integrated. And they started that in like 1860. It was like before the Civil War, that's how they were teaching. And so I thought, well, this is really cool. I want to be a part of this lineage of teaching. And so I taught for 7 years. I loved doing that. But then ultimately I got pulled back into being an artist. And it's not like I never wasn't an artist. I was still making records and I was producing records when I was, being a professor. But at a certain point, it was like, well, I did my 7 years of teaching and I loved it, but I'm really supposed to just be producing records. The long journey of music will take you a lot of different places. It'll take you all over the world. It'll expose you to a lot of different cultures and different ways of seeing the world. And then it's your job to synthesize that into some kind of musical statement.
The one thing as we go through this pandemic, and if we take away all of the things, all of us have seen people leave the planet. There's been so many levels of this that's been traumatic, but there's also been lots of this where, we aren't in control. Nature decided to grind the brakes down, and we've all been kind of in this more self-reflective place. And as an artist, as we reemerge and things are starting to get better, an artist, and even as a human, how do you see yourself being stronger and approaching maybe the stage or the page in a way that's different than you did before this all began?
Well, one of the things we noticed because we're living in this remote area that's surrounded by wildlife, so we saw wildlife every day, But when I would read the news, I noticed, oh, wow, like the skies are clearing over Beijing, China, because they're not manufacturing at the same rate. And a lot of people saw the blue sky for the first time, because all the time it's this white, smoky haze. I've never been there, but my wife has. She was over there a lot, and she said, you never see the blue sky in China. There was that story about how the water in the Mediterranean got very clear, and there were porpoises, and you could see the bottom of the canals in Venice because the water was so clear. And I think what that taught everybody was that if we just slow down and stop doing all the stuff that's polluting, the earth will rebound. It'll come back, and pretty quickly it does. And you see that with rivers. Like if you stop dumping pollutants into a river, the river will filter it out and it'll clean itself. But you just have to stop putting pollutants into it. I think the 12 or 14 months when everything was kind of locked down, everybody around the world saw this, and everybody knows this in their mind. But then it's up to the individual to figure out, like, okay, what can I do to help clean the earth or stop doing anything to pollute it or minimize my pollution? And that's the thing we all have to think about. These are individual decisions and individual choices, but the earth was really teaching us something. It was really showing us, here's what it could be like if you choose to save this planet. Here's what will happen.
Every day you get to wake up, you get to be a creative creature and make music and write and do, you have your art. What is the greatest part about being a creative person, about being a professional musician for you?
Well, I will say this, when you decide to become a professional artist of any kind, musician or writer or filmmaker or visual artist or poet, you will be challenged in ways that you can't really imagine, because yes, it's true, a lot of it is creative, and like I go to my studio and I work, and some days I'm just not inspired, but I just go and I make myself do, just play an instrument or work on something, and an idea emerges. And this is the thing about being an artist, is that it doesn't happen like, it's not like you suddenly have this burst of inspiration and you realize everything in its totality all at once. I mean, maybe that happens to some people, but I've never had that happen. It's always been this just kind of slow, methodical, chip away, work on that song, develop it, evolve it, and then at a certain point, there it is. And the same thing is true with the way that I write. I work on a story, and then I have a group of stories, and then I have a book. But like, I was editing my new book like up until just like a few days ago before it went to the printer, because I wanted to keep perfecting it as much as I could. So the rewarding part is when you see the finished product of what you've created, a beautiful album, a really entertaining book of stories, or you play an amazing show and everybody in the room is transformed by it. You just feel really good inside that you help bring some light into that room and into those people's hearts. That's the really beautiful part of it. And I mean, I just have to say that for me, that's what inspires me to be an artist in the first place. But there's just so much other stuff you have. I mean, if you have your own record label or your own business like I do, there's just so much of this other stuff you have to do to be an artist. You still have to manage all those details. And so, you really develop a very well-rounded mind in your ability to do art and do business and communicate with people and promote yourself to the world and still do great art. I mean, I think it might be, second only to like being, like an astronaut or a professional athlete or something. It's like the most challenging job you can have, but it's incredibly rewarding too.
Absolutely. Everyone has a perception of you, your family, your friends, your fans, but ultimately you live your life. You have a perception of you. Who do you think you are?
Oh, wow. That's that's like one of those questions my wife would ask me. That's a good one, though. She's very intuitive. I'll tell you what I am. I am a person that really loves this world. I love this earth. I love this planet. And I really do love people, and I love culture. I love the diversity of human culture and how interesting it is, like all over the world, and, you know, all the different places that I've been to and that my wife and I have traveled to and people I've worked with. It's just really incredible. And so I think I'm one of those people that just wants to protect the world and protect people, but I also want people to wake up and see how intimately they are connected to the natural world, to their environment, to the animals, to every part of their life. And I just hope that somehow the music that I make and the bands that I've been in over the years, and, you know, the stories and books that I've been writing in the last few years, I just hope it kind of helps people wake up to see that connectedness. And I feel that way because I grew up, you know, in a forest, you know, like on a homestead, you know, where we grew our own vegetables and had, you know, grew our own livestock, and that was very common in the 70s, that whole back to the land thing. But I've seen, as I've, you know, become a middle-aged adult, and I see how we can be disconnected from that. Like, we're connected in a different way through the internet and social media, but then we are also disconnected from the fact that we're natural biological beings. And so that connection to the earth is really important. I mean, it's paramount, really, for us to survive. So that's what I do, and that's who I think I am. I think I'm somebody that tries to awaken people to the beauty of their naturalness and the connection to this planet.
Right on, man. Barrett, hey, thank you for opening up. Thank you for your time today, man. Good luck with everything as we move forward.
Thanks a lot, Joe. It was a pleasure talking with you, and great questions. Very, very good questions.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in Washington, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Barrett for his time, music, and cool. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino in the iTunes Store. Visit neonjazz at youtube.com, and for everything Neon Jazz all the time, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.